Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. As always, I am coming to you from my makeshift podcast studio in Crystal River, Florida. We call it the Nature Coast because it absolutely lives up to its name. Situated on Florida's west coast, Crystal River, Florida is one of this country's best-kept secrets. We are surrounded by 7 spring-fed rivers. That is 72 degrees all year long. And in the winter, like January, we just grab a sweatshirt or a hoodie and we go see the hundreds, if not thousands, of manatee that come in from the Gulf of Mexico, just a 10 to 15 minute short jaunt out by boat. When I moved here in 2010, we looked for houses the hard way, internet surfing, and literally driving around looking in windows. Even though, as a native Floridian, I think we should close the borders at this time, I have a secret for only the Wednesdays with Watson listeners. Today's podcast is sponsored by Meek Real Estate. Meek Real Estate has been serving Citrus County since 1981. Amy Meek, both a friend of mine and our mayor's wife, is today's sponsor, and she is a faithful listener. She is a rock star boy mom and a lover of Jesus. She is a lover of redemption, therefore she is a big supporter of the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. She has held many prestigious positions and has received a multiplicity of awards. But as a native of this beautiful county, she is doing everything at her business to bring families and thereby jobs into this beautiful place that not many people know about. So if you're tired of being cold in January, consider contacting Amy. She will connect you with your forever home or an investment property. You know, I say a lot of relatively smart things on this podcast, but hear me when I say this. I am a city girl, but I have loved living here, particularly over the last 18 months. I love the slower pace, and we call it the Nature Coast for a reason. Houses here will either become non-existent or property values will continue to skyrocket. So contact Amy at meekrealestate.com or call 352-364-4132. Personally, I want to thank Amy for her support of this podcast and a faithful encourager of our mission here. Okay, now, except for you guys, Amy Watson officially closes the Florida borders. And now for today's show. Sometimes as Christians, we somehow think that the statistics like 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime doesn't apply to us. As human and flawed parents want the best for their children, it is a special kind of hard when a statistic like this literally hits smack dab in the center of a Christ-centered, 2-parent, loving home. My guest today, Troy McLaughlin, has agreed to join the Wednesdays with Watson podcast as he shares his family's struggles as the fallout from his child's trauma still very much lives with them today. He told me her story, one that included inpatient stints in facilities to current physical separation, because his child's trauma left marks and the consequences of the evil of another are far-reaching. So Troy is here today to talk to us about parenting trauma. You will find us both guarded, as his child could easily hear this podcast, and in deference to them, we will handle this story with tender, loving care. I have received many, many requests for a guest like this, and I am grateful to Troy that he has agreed to join the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. This is Parenting with PTSD. So welcome my podcasting friend, my podcasting buddy, Troy McLaughlin. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for having me on.
I'm so honored. I always love having other podcasters because we have good mics and all of that good stuff. And so, well, as everybody knows, my podcast is short and sweet and to the point. So we're going to just jump right in. So you heard me read a little bit of your journey, parenting a child with trauma. I wonder if you can help listeners understand a little bit more of the journey as much as you feel comfortable, because as you know, as many people know, I write those cold openings according to what you've told me. This is very sensitive. So I want you to add to anything that you would feel comfortable doing that would help us understand how to parent PTSD.
Well, let me start with a quote by Fyodor Dostoevsky. He wrote a ton of books. He's the Russian Brothers Karamazov, and I think it was War and Peace or whatever. But He said to love someone means to see them as God intended them. Oftentimes we don't do that because we look at the world in our own eyes. It's very difficult to have eyes of empathy and realizing, even in the current situation, whatever that may be, especially if it's going sideways, that this isn't the way that life was intended, that these people, that whoever you're viewing, that their hearts were intended. And when Jesus is on the cross, he looks out and says, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing, right? So there's a realization that they don't really know what they're doing, even though they do know what they're doing. So I just I want to start there, because I think oftentimes we look at life in our limited views, and it's very difficult to remember. And this go back to me as a parent. I need to remember that I'm dealing with somebody who's looking through the lens of what they've gone through. So when they say hurtful things, when they do things that you just go, why did they do that? Well, they're living through their lens, and it's hard, especially as a parent. You think, well, wait a minute, we've done you would think, a good job, and yet it doesn't change the circumstance. So yeah, I just had my oldest, my daughter, just went through a ringer, and you get phone calls, and we were driving home last night. My wife's like, does she remember how often that we went and rescued her? Does she? And like I said, the fallout is still there. And here's the thing, and this was and hopefully I'm not talking too long. This isn't too long of an answer for you, but I had a good friend of mine who made this observation. His name was John Lynch. He may not have made the original observation, but he said, Jesus will wipe away our tears. So we are walking into heaven, in essence, or coming into heaven still in pain and trauma, right? He's wiping away the tears literally when we see him. So I wish that the situation wasn't is the way it was, but if I look at scripture and I go, wait a minute, we're still going to walk into the heavenly situation with tears in our eyes. So we're still going to deal with it.
And as Tolkien says, all the sad things will become untrue.
Yeah.
I love that so much. And I love that you're talking about looking through the lens, because as a PTSD patient, particularly over the last 18 months, it's very difficult. And I'm 50 years old, not 32. I'm not 50 yet. I shouldn't say that about myself. I'll be 50 in December. But even now I have to sit down, even this morning, with one of my closest friends and say, try to look at this situation from this perspective. And so when you said that to me on the pre-interview, I thought that was huge as a parent. And that is what this podcast is for. If you're a parent out there and your child has experienced trauma, all of your life is going to be disrupted from, like you said, inpatient stint. So it's going to hit you financially. It's going to hit you emotionally. It's going to hurt other children in the family. And as parents, you're going to feel like failures a little bit. But I think that you're being able to frame it, which clearly sounds like a download from Jesus himself in your head, to, I want to look at this from her lens, is so huge here. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, because you're one of the first men that I've had on my podcast, and I think that this is a good topic for one of the first men that I have. But as the leader of your home, as the father, the protector, like we just talked about Jesus, like I love, there's a meme going around where we finally land in heaven and we just fall into his arms. I'm not a father, so I don't understand that. But I wondered if you could go back just for a second to a little bit of those pain points. As the leader of your home, how did you try to normalize it? Or could you normalize it in any way? Or how did it hit you as a father?
Well, as a father, I think the most troubling, or the most challenging thing was, how do you protect your kids? That's your primary. You feel like that's your primary job, and yet you can't. You can and you can't. You can do your best, but that still doesn't keep the world from coming in. And then I think I've had to just learn to realize that, as a parent, that it's their lives. It's not ours. We don't own it. We steward it, and we steward it as well as we can. And I think this, I'll make this encouragement to someone who's listening, maybe even as a dad. It's okay that the situation's not okay. That's, I mean, and you walking through it, that's okay. That's life. And don't beat yourself up about it, because there may not have been anything you could have done that would have prevented it. So don't feel like, maybe you look at it and feel guilty about it. Well, maybe I could have done something else. That's water under the bridge. There's not, most times, because we are human beings, people make choices. There's people that make choices against us or against those we love that we have no control over. And I think this is really good. Keller said this, Tim Keller, he's an author. He says, the main problem in your life is not what happened to you, not what people have done to you. Your main problem is the way you respond to that. Okay. How do we respond to the things that happen to not only us, but to others, especially those who are close to us, in a way that we realize that, okay, there's not many things that we can control in our lives.
Right.
There just is
really.
not.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we can kind of control our attitude, kind of control our actions. I mean, we have two jobs: love people, love God. And most days I'm not really good at it. I mean, if I'm honest, right?
Right.
And that starts, oftentimes that starts with us. And this is one quote that I fall on a lot. This is Henry Nouwen, and I think this frames it really well. He says, over the years, I've come to realize that the greatest trap in our lives is not success, popularity, or power, but self-rejection. Okay, that voice that's inside the back of my head that runs over and over, the groove that it makes of, well, I always do this, or this is right. That conversation that we have with ourselves all the time. One of the things, and they've discovered this, right? Science now knows that we can change the way our minds work.
Right. We've talked about it a lot on this podcast.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, there's something like 11 layers of this. I mean, that they've discovered, right? One of the verses in the New Testament is, right, whatever is true, whatever is kind, you think on the, and boom, 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 right? We go over that whatever is true, and we just skip on to the rest of it, I think, often.
Well, okay, let's stop there for a second. Oh, wow. Okay, so that's Philippians 4:8.
Right.
Right. So we skip over the whatever is true to avoid the pain.
Sure. I think that's true. But I also think if we don't start with what's true.
Which, tell me what that is. Sovereignty of God.
But all of those things, right? So, okay, so let's just, and one of the reasons why we skip over what's true is we don't know the character of God, because oftentimes we don't spend time either in community, in his book, in prayer. Okay, so we don't have an anchor point that we can go back to and go, oh, wait a minute. This thing that I'm saying to myself, that it's going over and over in my head, is not true. Why is it not true? Well, this is, okay. I mean, you can do this with literally with relationships that we have, whether it's wife or spouse or a friend. Well, we always make up a story. We're people of narratives, right? You see the little 3 dots going off in your phone and you're like, oh, and then they don't send you your message.
Then it disappears.
Right. So, and what's the thing that oftentimes you do? You always view it as the worst thing. We make the worst up of it. Oh man, they don't want to talk to me. Maybe I said something wrong, right? So there's the narrative in our heads. And then if you add trauma and you add a struggle and you add all these other things, right? You take those circumstances and then you add that to it. And you go, well, look at this. Look what happened. Look, right? And maybe if you're a victim of it, you're thinking the same thing. Well, maybe it was my fault. Maybe it was right. Maybe I did something, right? As opposed to what's true. No, there's evil in the world. There are people who make choices that are evil. And because of that, there's a mess and detritus that, and yet God says, I'm always with you, even in the worst of it. I think it was one of the Holocaust survivors had talked about this. Somebody had said, well, where was God in it? He's, as these people were getting, hung in the rafters, and he says, God was right there in the rafters with us.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's hard when you're going through it, when everything goes sideways and you're like, well, wait a minute, it's going sideways. So if it's going sideways, because we think I put in 50 cents, I get 50 cents back. No, that's not the way.
Right.
We kind of this karma kind of thinking, well, I did everything right. It should have turned out well. Well, no.
Well, we don't live in a perfect world. And I talk a lot on this podcast about, all of my listeners aren't believers, right?
Right.
And Jesus, the star of my story. And we'll talk about that in a minute. He's clearly the star of yours too. But you just said something that I think everybody can hang on to, because we as believers believe that the scripture is the inerrant, infallible, truth, authority, word of God, right? So we can go back even in these times of pain, and that Philippians 4:8 verse is one of my favorite verses. And I'm going to be chewing on what you just said for a while, that we often skip over what is true, whether it's the inner critic in our head or the truth of what happened to your child. And I don't know what it was like for you in those early years, but I know in my own trauma, I spent 35 years just not paying attention to what was true, what was evil is in the world. And we kind of have a choice with what to do with it. And so
let me do this real quick, because you're a podcaster and I'm a podcaster. Let me ask you a question about that. We won't get too specific, but that it took you 35 years to kind of start to do that, right?
Yeah.
So I think if you're listening to this, you're a parent. Remember that this may take a very long time. This may be a road. You may see glimpses of good, and then it goes back to the other way. Hang in there. Make sure that, here's the other thing. I don't think we often do this. When we're walking through these things, or we're talking to others about it, everybody needs a therapist. Now it may not be quote unquote professional therapy, but it's a community belonging, and we need to bounce these things off, because oftentimes, like you said, this thing is going on in our head that may not be true. Let's say we go to our friends and we say, hey, this is what's going on and this is what I feel, and they're like, well, that's not true. Oh, wait a minute. Because if it's our own voice, we're going to go down the dark road most times.
It's so funny that you say that, because we have the 3 C's on my podcast, and so it's church, community, and trauma-informed counseling. So you actually kind of teed that up for me. But one of the things that I think that you said was so important, and then I just want to take one step back just for a second, but it's this idea of time. And so if you're out there and you're a parent and you're listening to this, and here's the thing too, that Troy is maybe or maybe not currently living with, but is often true with trauma, and certainly I've shared my own journey, is that traumatized people make poor decisions post-trauma, and they make a multiplicity of poor decisions unless somebody intervenes. And that oftentimes is not the parents, but it is things like community, it is things like church, it is things like trauma-informed counseling. So you're bringing up therapy is huge, because there's such a stigma to it, not only in the church, but in the world in general. There's such a stigma to it. And so I really want the listeners to hear you when you say that, because if you're a parent out there who has a child who has been traumatized, there are going to be some emotions that you're going to work through, but take some time and then understand that the fallout is the fallout. And here's the thing, and Troy, I'd love to know whether you agree with me on this. The fallout does not belong to you.
No, I think if we lean into Genesis 1, when the world went sideways, however you believe that, whether it was 7 days literally or whatever, I don't know that it matters. But the narrative of the story is when everything went sideways, because we decided that we wanted to make our own decisions. We wanted to be God. We wanted to know what good and evil was. Well, we don't have that capacity.
Right.
That's God's capacity. When we start making those, and the fallout is so much deeper than I think we ever know. Because when we hear sin, we start to think, we start to, I think, put it in order. What's the
In a
worst?
hierarchy.
Yes,
Yeah.
in a higher, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, literally the
Doesn't work
Greek, I
that
think,
way.
means it's missing the mark, right? It's not. So God's intention was to walk around with us and be with us, right? And for us not to carry that burden, and that burden has put us where we're at. But I mean, thank goodness that we have a rescuer, right? That
Amen.
we have redemption, and we have these things that we can lean into. But this is where, as a parent, as a friend, we have to be involved with others in a community where we can come and just share our story.
Yeah.
One, so that somebody else can give us a different perspective, because our perspective is off. Like you said, if you've gone through anything traumatic, you're looking through a lens of your trauma, not the true lens. And here's the other thing. I don't know that God's made us in such a way, or the brain in such a way, that it can do things for self-preservation. You were able to get through, like you or my daughter or someone else who's walked through some really tough things. Your brain can do certain things to protect you. But what happens is, especially if you're younger and things happen later on in life, those things, that self-protection is not the same as self-care, right?
Right.
And then our view, and if we're always in the self-protection mode, right, that's not good for our relation. Typically, with our relationships, because our brain responds differently. We're in this fight or flight all the time. And one of the things, and I was listening to, I can't remember who it was, a doctor talking about, and they found that you can't be in fight or flight, which is that fear-based, I need to survive, and be in empathy and love at the same time.
Right. Or you can't be in fight or flight and rest and digest, which is just basic human needs.
Right. And or you can't be fight or flight or in a creative spot. Right. So one of those things, like we talked about, whatever is true, oftentimes if you're walking through something that's not true, and you can just pause long enough to say, wait a minute, is this true? Is what I'm thinking true? Maybe you need to reference a script, Bible, a book, a friend, a community, and just ask that question. Pause long enough to say, wait a minute, is this true? Even though the circumstances look like this is, well, they did this, so they don't like me.
Right.
Maybe not. Maybe not. It just, I think sometimes maybe.
And when you say they did this because they didn't like me, you're talking about the traumatized child.
Yes. Oh, hey, like I said, and here's the thing. It's like I said, it's very difficult. You know, they walk through, you know what you've done as a parent, you know, you're the rescuer, you've take care of them. It's like, why don't you remember what we've done for you? Why?
Yeah.
Well, if you've got this thing it's a blinder, it's hard to see. And if I can remember that Jesus literally was dying, getting crucified on a cross, and he was literally looking out, and these people, the Romans were the pros at putting people to death. They'd done a lot of this. What was it? 4 BC, I think there was like 2,000 crucifixions. This wasn't something right? And yet Jesus says, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
So
let me ask you quickly. So if somebody's listening to this right now, mm-hmm. and so this was 16-ish years ago for you and your family, and if somebody's listening to this right now and their child has just been traumatized, what do you wish you would have known? Because you have done, like, my notes, like I'm closing my notes right now, because interviewing podcasters is the easiest thing in the world to do. And you brought your game today. But I do have people listening to this podcast right now that maybe their child has recently been traumatized. What do you wish you would have known in those early days?
Well, part of it was we didn't know what was going on, right?
Mm.
We didn't find out some of this stuff until later. But if I would have known, man, the problem is I'm 55 now, so I've got
Right.
a
And you
few
didn't
more
know.
years underneath me. So if you were to find out what's going on, I would lean into, first of all, getting help for yourself as you're as a parent, because you're having to view and figure it out yourself. The guilt, did we do something wrong? Did we make mistakes? Be involved in a community. I would say therapy. I really would. I would say get therapy, walk through it. So, and when people hear that, I think there's often a stigmatism. I mean,
Yeah.
what's a good therapist? What do? They ask good questions. They ask good
Right.
questions and they walk you through. Yeah. And go to somebody who's really trained, because you need a safe environment to do that. And that, I think that would be really, you have to lean into others who can help you. I know I've referenced this a lot, but so that your view of what's happening is changed, or at least is maybe your direction of what you're looking at just a little bit, so that you can get a better perspective. Because I think our perspective is just is altered when we walk through trauma, either literally ourselves or for parents. It alters the landscape.
It really does alter the landscape. And, we have an enemy who does not want us to get that lens change, right? He does not want us to get the Philippians 4:8 lens change.
Yeah.
I wish I had that in front of me so I could read every one of them to you. But as a parent, as a traumatized child, I can see how a verse like Philippians 8, I can try to think of all 8 of them off the top of my head: true, honest, praiseworthy, excellent. I can't remember all 8 of them, but if you think of them, one of my friends taught me, as you're going to the beach and you're putting all these shells in this sifter and you sift it. And if it's not true, it goes out. If it's not honest, if it's not excellent, if it's not praiseworthy, if it's not the other 4 that I can't remember, you leave it, right? And so I know that as a trauma survivor and victim myself, I have not had a loved one close to me endure trauma, and I'm particularly as a parent. And so I can't imagine how that must have felt. But I think your message here today is so important, is that it's all about your perspective, and it's all about trying to look at it. And this is true about anybody's trauma, whether it's your child or your friend or whatever. And you, without listening to any of my podcasts or really being prepped at all, have hit on everything that I preach all the time, is that community is really important. So parents, if you're out there and your child has been traumatized, obviously do all the important stuff first, particularly if it's one of these statistics that I mentioned today, the 1 in 4, the 1 in 7 sexual assault. There are some very practical things that you have to do first, but then you have to remember that, and it's one of my favorite verses, and it's Hebrews 4:15, and Troy has talked about that a lot here today, is that we do not serve a high priest who is unfamiliar with our sufferings. And so he understands. And so the only other thing, Troy, that I would love to ask you is, and really, you can encourage other parents listening to this, because I'm thinking of one in particular in my mind that's going to listen to this podcast and go, oh my gosh, I needed to hear that. So the trauma happened 16 years ago, and I'm this is a hypothetical in some ways, because I don't know the whole story on purpose, but particularly in trauma like has happened with your child, there are some things that happened that are outside of what we would really love for our children to live. Promiscuity being one of them. Again, don't know that that's your daughter's story or not, but I wondered if you could share with us briefly how you guys have handled any of that fallout, because trauma in this respect, a lot of times, unless you get help very early on, does turn into, and there's for listeners out there, in season 1 of Wednesdays with Watson, there's 3 episodes called The Memory Keeper. And that's when I brought one of my best friends on my podcast with me, and she was helping me know the things that I couldn't remember, things that I had lied about, attention-seeking behavior, all of that. We got on the podcast and we got real with it, because the reality is, unless your child, parent out there, gets this help and can process it properly, they're going to make bad decisions. Troy, how do you and your wife stop that from making you feel like you're bad parents?
You have to look at it. You have to almost step back from it, even though when you're in the midst of it, because when those things happen, oftentimes when somebody goes through trauma or pain, hurt people.
Yeah.
I mean, so if you're walking through, it's like, whoa, can I remember that? And does it not take the pain away? No, you still go through it. There's still pain. But I think, and let this be an encouragement. And I referenced this earlier on. We're going to walk into heaven with tears in our eyes. They're going to be wiped away then. So the pain, most likely, or some part of it, may never go away. But that doesn't mean we can't experience joy and love. There's a whole book in the Bible. We avoid it. Lamentations. A whole book. Okay. We have a whole book where we're in a sense, David or whoever wrote it, airs their grievances to God, because God is the only one who could really take our grievances. You read some of the Psalms. Some of the Psalms don't end well. Some of them do, right? Hey, you start out complaining, and then at the end, you're not. But there are verses where David's like, God, just destroy my enemies. I think there's one verse in there that's it's to the, hey, take my enemies' babies and throw them against the rocks, right?
Yeah.
That made it into God's book. So
it's okay to feel.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's not even okay. It's okay to express to God and point our finger to God and say, why this? And he's like, oh, okay. Right.
And why my child? Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Why my child?
Yeah. And then why do I have to do why do I have to deal with this?
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask you one more question. How about other children in the home? How did it affect them, and how did you guys try to make sure that you could protect them as much as possible, not necessarily from the trauma, but from the fallout of the trauma?
It still affects us. It still
fair
affects
enough.
them.
Thank you for being honest.
It does. I don't, and I wish I could. I think sometimes we get the idea that if we do 4 things, A, B, C, and D, that we'll get the result of this. It'll be better. And I don't know that that's the case.
The Bible doesn't teach that, right?
No. Here's the thing. We hear this thing called, this churchy word called sanctification. And let me reference it to this. When we go to the doctor, they call it medical. What's the second word? Practice. So wait a minute. I'm going in with a life-threatening situation, whatever that might be, and a doctor's practicing on me. Yep. Our lives are practice. Okay. Our spiritual lives are practice. Our whole life is a practice, which means we will continue to, you watch a baseball game or a professional, right? I don't know how many ground balls they've taken in their life, thousands and thousands. And you watch a game, you're like, why did he miss the ball? He's a pro. He should not miss the ball. He's right. Well, how about if we have that same discussion with ourselves in our own lives? Well, I should know better. Yeah, maybe, but you're a human, and guess what? We're still going to make those mistakes, or we're still going to think the same way. So
let yourself off the hook as a parent is what you're saying.
Give yourself a break. Say,
have some compassion for yourself.
Yeah. That idea, right? Henry Noonan, right? The self-rejection thing, right? Oh, wait a minute. Brene Brown said it this way. She says, true belonging only happens when we present our authentic and perfect selves to the world. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. Okay, so maybe I need to lead my life with like the 12 steps. I'm Troy. This is what I'm going through. Everybody in the room says, whew.
Hi, Troy.
Hi, Troy. Right? I'm not the only one. Or hi, Amy. Right?
Right.
And I think when we lead with that, as opposed to this shouldn't be this way, or I should know better.
Transparency and authenticity is what you're saying.
Yeah, we go to our kids when we can, and admit when we're just wrong.
And more importantly, going to Jesus. I don't need to ask you if he's the star of your story, because he is the star of your story. You are a dream to interview. And what I want to say to you is I'm so grateful for my interaction with you. I think we met on the Clubhouse platform, and now we're in the podcast world together. And what you have done for me today, I came into this and I have got a day full of interviews, but what you've done for me today by that last little bit that you said about practicing compassion on ourselves is so huge. Looking through the lens of the traumatized person and just continue to walk. And I love that verse in Revelation 21:5, which is kind of the Bible version of Tolkien's, when all the sad things will become untrue. The Bible says that he will make all things new. And so parents out there listening, you will walk into heaven with tears in your eyes. We all will. But as we mentioned that verse in Hebrews 4:15, we do not serve a high priest who is unfamiliar with our sufferings. And so let's start a 12-step program. My name is Amy. I am this. I need help with this. We've talked about community. We've talked about church. We've talked about counseling. Troy, it's been an absolute honor to interview you. Your authenticity is so honoring and so pleasing to the Lord. I would love for you to tell people now where they can find you, because as we mentioned, you're a podcasting buddy, and I'm going to actually be on your show. But before we close here, tell people where they can find you. And I want you to know how grateful I am to you, and we'll be praying for you and your family.
Well, I appreciate it. The easiest way right now, we're rebuilding the website. So that's, if you try to go there, you're not going to get there. But This Undivided Life and my first podcast is called Project Pastor. It's been around since 2013. It's amazing. I think we've done about 260 episodes.
Wow.
So,
well, you're 35. So, I was thinking this morning, maybe I'll quit when I get to 100, but I only drop every other week. And so, well, listen, thank you so much for coming on today. I know that you clearly have gotten the help that you guys need. I know you're still walking through it. But I wanted parents out there to know that there's hope. And I think that you've given that to them today. And so thank you so much for being on the show. And I hope you'll come back.
You're more than welcome, Amy. Thanks a bunch.
All right. Thanks, Troy. Well, guys, that was certainly a powerful story. And I'd like to thank our guest for coming on today, because I know from experience that getting behind a microphone and telling story of such pain is not always easy. And so I am so grateful to our guest for doing that today. I would also like to thank Phil Baker. That's his song playing us out of the podcast, a song called Marked by You. You can find him on iTunes, and that song in particular is found on his album called Babylon. I am so honored, as always, that you continue to take the time to listen to our message of hope and healing. Season 2 is the healing zone, as we mentioned. This is the place where I hope that you walk away with some hope in your heart, because we believe that healing people help people. And because of that, I would love to invite you to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, rate and review it. This helps us get the word out, helps keep the podcast coming up in search engines so that we can get this into the earbuds of people that need it. If you need me, I am easy to find on all social media. Just Google Wednesdays with Watson and you'll find me in all of the places. When you get there, though, make sure that you hit all those buttons, like and share, and everything that just continues to help us get the message out. We will see you in a couple weeks, 2 weeks to be exact, and until then, let the healing continue. So that my life glorify